Okay, I'm Dan Shelton of Shelton Brothers. I think on the internet we may have promised controversy. I don't know. I may pussy out on that one. I'm not sure. I've been talking politics all day about this, and I think what today might turn out to be more than anything else is a kind of a celebration of the few people who are really dedicated to keeping traditional Lambic alive. They know more than anybody here how hard that has been. The fact that they're here now is it's almost a miracle. It's not easy for them to get away. They're working all the time. I want, I guess, to make a sort of an initial statement about Lambic. Obviously, I'm not the person who should be talking most. I just happen to talk a lot, but we want to hear from these guys, and I know that's what you're here for. Well, a few things about where we are and why. Here in Philadelphia, well, we've discovered the absolute best beer culture in the U.S. I haven't been everywhere, but I'm inclined to say that. And I've been repeating this story too much, and everybody here at the table especially is sick of it. But when I arrived at our hotel in Philadelphia a few days ago, we were checking in, and Jean, at the end, was wearing his Cantillon t-shirt, and the guy at the hotel pointed to the Cantillon sign on Jean's shirt and said, "That's great beer." And I said, "Oh, that's the brewer." And the guy lit up like crazy and immediately started giving us all kinds of free stuff. And I said right then, this is the best beer place in the country. It's a good place to be, and it's especially good, I think, to be here because, as you see the Sphinx behind us, the beer we're going to talk about today, Lambic, it has the longest history of beer in the world. It goes back to the Egyptians, and in fact goes back further than that to the Sumerians, generally thought to be the first people to develop a stable civilization in one place. But the Egyptians probably developed it to a finer art than the Sumerians. The way that people made beer, including the Egyptians, of course, until about the 1840s, when Louis Pasteur discovered yeast and explained it to people, was that beer was created spontaneously. And you'll hear that word all the time when you're talking about Lambic, spontaneous fermentation. It's also described as fermentation by wild yeast. And as probably everybody here knows already, but it bears repeating, there's yeast all around us. And we didn't know about it until somebody pointed it out, but it's invisible. But what happened with the Egyptians was simply that if you put grains soaked in water out in the open air, which I'm sure they did accidentally originally, after a few hours, maybe a day, it would start to foam up, and which must have intrigued people enough to cause them to want to drink the stuff that was happening there. And they found that it had a pleasantly sweet and then a little bit sour taste, which would get increasingly sour, but it also kind of made you happy. And that was the way beer was made after that. Just let it happen. No one knew why, but it just happened, That's the way it was done for years and years and years. And eventually, when they figured out what yeast was, they began to culture the yeast and work with the yeast to get things like sourness out of the beer. Now, most people were happy about that, to have beer that wasn't sour, but then some people weren't. And the people especially who weren't and are famous for actually liking sour beer are in Belgium. And they're in the area around Brussels. It's called the Pajottenland. Normally, there's different words to describe it. But those people have preserved this history, tradition, this art of making beer the old way without adding yeast. You let the yeast fall into the beer naturally, and overnight, the wort, what will become beer, begins to ferment. And then you put it into barrels and tend it for some length of time, a year, 2, 3 years even, and then go from there to make the various beers we're going to talk about today. The only people who've commercially done this kind of wild yeast fermentation are the people who are here. They will tell you how it's done, but it's something that's catching on more and more in the U.S., and more and more people in the U.S. are now trying to make beer like this. So it's a big movement these are the people that started the movement. And there's a lot of people here I know who are huge fans of these guys, and you're here to see them. The idea here, I guess, is to just go through the beers, and in the process of describing the beers and talking about how they're made, we'll talk about what they do, how it's done, and we'll talk about their passion for this stuff, which will be very obvious.